He met his victims on Grindr. His MO was that they were gay, Irish men and living alone. He went to his place and he stabbed him over 40 times. He decapitated him, placed his head on the bed, facing the door.
Yeah, he can deny it all he wants, and he can say that's forbidden under Islam, but I think it's very clear.
Yeah.
He clearly gay, in my opinion. About a horrific series of killings and an assault by a young man. He is 23, named Yousef Palani. The events took place over 4 days, involved someone having their eye stabbed out, and then later two brutal killings.
Brutal and so shocking, and they're still reeling from that. I'd imagine the community there, you know, and he was only sentenced there. He pleaded guilty to murder there the week before last, I think it was, or 2 or 3 weeks ago. But Yousef Palani was from Iraq, Kurdish ethnicity, moved here in 2006 when he was just 6 years old. So if you kind of think of the context and the backdrop, it would have been the Iraq war. And soon after Saddam Hussein was toppled and then executed. So what he had seen in those formative years of his life and what he'd experienced and what he was exposed to can't be discounted in looking at the factors that might have led to his certain types of behaviors. Now, it's a huge leap to say that's what caused this. Of course not. This is just examining, a personality like his, ripped from his home, his experience of refugee camps, his experience of probably death and destruction and loved ones being killed and being completely uprooted from where he knew, and then moving to Sligo in the northwest of Ireland. It was part of a UN program that him and his family were brought over here, and he is one of 8 siblings. So I think he was the second. Yeah. And so they were brought over in 2006 and they moved to Sligo, which is, as you said, in the northwest of Ireland, beside the sea. It was around 20,000 population, the town itself. And I lived there, as I was saying. I would have moved out of there at that point when he would have arrived. I think I moved out of Sligo in 2003, but he arrived and his family were moved into a house in Markievicz Heights, which would be beside the GAA grounds there, Markievicz Park, which would be very well known here. And in terms of integration, we don't know what support, if any, that the family received, in terms of integrating into the community there, because it doesn't seem like they really did, and that's part of it, that lack of identity maybe for him. And I just want to preface this with the fact that this is in no way any justification for his behavior. This is really about kind of looking at where he was coming from, I suppose, and it's all just looking at what he may have been feeling at the time. And then, so there were, and Circa Crowley, a colleague of mine who lives in Sligo, she did that really well, in-depth article with local knowledge of what happened, and interviewed a lot of the residents in Markievicz Heights in the estate at the time. I think there's about 45 houses there. And so they would have known this family very well, but they kind of stuck out. And they described Yousef Palani as a troublemaker from the start. That he was, disruptive, and they described an incident where when he was about 10 or 11, he was playing with the other kids just in the estate, that he started kicking the other kids. And of course the other parents would have been very upset by this, and then relations between the parents might have broken down. And they described him, there was a lot of antisocial behavior on his part. And then when he went into secondary school, there was an incident of him pulling sinks off the wall in the bathroom. So taken on its own, you might think, oh, maybe he was just messing, but that's a very extreme move on his, it's quite extreme there, in terms of, it would take a lot of force. There might have been a lot of rage there that was manifesting. And when we go back to when he was ripped from his home country that was war torn, obviously the human psyche will blank or block block things out that they just can't deal with, otherwise it implodes. So, but it's still there within your cell structure, and it's going to come out in some way if you're not dealing with it. Not to say everybody who's traumatized like that as a child is going to do something like that extreme, and there certainly is a link between childhood trauma and crime, and there is research to back this up. But when you think about childhood trauma leading to psychopathy, there's not enough potentially evidence to link them. But certainly in terms of trauma, you can be, if it's not managed correctly and treated correctly, you can lose empathy, you can be desensitized, and so from his point of view, pulling the sinks off the walls, taken on by itself, there's something there. There's certainly a flag to be raised there. It might be an orange flag, but I just think that takes a lot of strength and aggression and frustration on his part. And apparently he only hung out with one other boy in the school, and he was a foreign national as well. So, again, you have to question the integration into society as well. But the teachers, who were really shocked afterwards by what he'd done, described him as giddy, a bit daft, bit of a messer. So he came across as somebody who's kind of likable, but he also there was certainly antisocial behavior there that was an issue. And residents also said that, he wasn't officially charged with anything, or sorry, he wasn't officially convicted of anything, but he certainly was arrested in relation to criminal damage, and they would have seen him in handcuffs. So he was, known to the Gardaí to some extent. But how could they make that leap? How could they ever predict what was going to happen? And then he went to college in the local IT, but he pulled out of college, and he was described as being extremely intellectually challenged. So he wasn't interested in learning. He wasn't interested in school. So he was at the age of 23 when this happened. He was kind of adrift, really, and maybe trying to attach himself to something. And maybe, the guard said that his actions, these are the actions of a man who was, had so much hostility towards and prejudice towards and hatred towards gay people. But you kind of have to wonder why. Was it because of repression? Was it because in his religion, as he told Gardaí, this is banned? But he did insist that he wasn't gay. But his MO was to, and again, he disappeared for a few months. This is what local residents said in the months before the killings, that he wasn't seen. It wasn't that he went missing, but they didn't notice him around. And then he reappeared a few weeks beforehand. They noticed. So that's really significant in terms of what was he doing in those few months? Was this him kind of trying to attach himself to something to gain some kind of notoriety, an identity for himself? I did say in that article that potentially, and this is all speculation, like in terms of copycat killings, I was reading there about, I don't know if you've heard of it, Stephen Port in the UK, in London, he targeted gay men on the LGBT app Grindr, and that was back in 2014, 2015. And he was sentenced to life eventually, but he targeted them on Grindr. They were gay men. They were all, I think he was approaching 40, he was 40, but they were a good bit younger than him, in their 20s. And he targeted them, lured them to his flat. He had come out, I think, in his 20s, and he had lived with his parents until he was in his 30s. And then he had purchased this apartment, and that's what he used to lure them to his flat. And when he lured them there, he, administered obviously toxic levels of the date drug. He raped them, and then he disposed of their bodies. And actually, it appeared in the media again around 2022, early 2022, when the Met were being critiqued and investigated in relation to how they investigated these killings, because they were being critiqued because they didn't link the 4 deaths quickly enough until after the 4th death. And in at least 2 of those killings, he left the bodies at a graveyard, the same area. And so when the postmortems were carried out, it looked like it was an overdose, but their phones were missing. So then they weren't suspicious initially. So just in terms of, there's so much out there. And from Yousef Palani's point of view, he had a lot of time on his hands. He was unemployed. He wasn't in college. And if there were some mental health issues potentially there, even though I know that he was assessed in the Central Mental Hospital, there was nothing there in terms of our insanity legislation, that there was a mental disorder and he couldn't stop himself from doing what he did, and that he, didn't know the seriousness of his actions. But certainly there may have been, he may have been going through an episode where he wanted to attach himself to something, and he was really angry. And then there could have been a precipitating event where we also heard that there were TikTok videos that he deleted where he was interacting with a trans woman. And oftentimes when people, go out and carry out these spree killings, there is something that triggers them. So this is, again, all speculation. But in those few weeks or the months beforehand, what he was doing, that's the really important element of this. And will we ever know, because the guards went and found out he hadn't been radicalized. There was no link to terrorism on his behalf. And so they did their due diligence, and they were satisfied that this was just somebody who was driven by hate and prejudice against gay men. And what he did was he met his victims on Grindr, and he made sure his MO was that they were gay Irish men and living alone, very importantly, because he was planning ahead on how he was going to, kill them, carry out the killings. And so we heard about Anthony Burke, who survived, but is hugely traumatized, obviously, by what happened. He's lost the sight in one eye. He came across Yousef Palani on the app, and Yousef Palani came to his house, and he said, they were chatting about who he was chatting to on Grindr, and Yousef Palani, I think Yousef Palani actually mentioned Aidan Moffat, who was the next victim. And he was uncomfortable. Anthony Burke was uncomfortable because Yousef Palani was very much obsessed with tying people up, and Anthony wasn't interested in this. So he, eventually persuaded him to leave. But Yousef Palani then contacted him the next day on another app, which is more anonymous, and he came back to the house. And Anthony Burke, they engaged in some sexual activity, and it was consensual. So just being mindful that he said he's not gay, but there is evidence of that happening at least once in this series of incidents. And he just was very uncomfortable again with him. He kept his jacket on, he said, and he later found out he was carrying the knife in that jacket. And he eventually said, okay, you need to leave. So he walked him out of the house and away. Good luck. But unfortunately, Yousef Palani came from behind, I think, and stabbed him in the eye. So, and watched him collapse as the blood drained from his eye, and then took off on his bike. By the way, he was cycling to all of these areas. And you just have to think about Anthony Burke at this stage, trying to stay conscious, and the trauma of, he actually lost the sight in that eye. But Yousef Palani, from his MO point of view, he was setting out that night to kill Anthony Burke. There's no doubt about it. And he actually spoke to Anthony Burke about how many people he had been, in contact with. And Anthony Burke described it as a kill list of, I think, up to 12 people that he had. And that just shows, I suppose, Yousef Palani thought he was going to kill Anthony Burke, so it didn't matter what he said to him. And he left, and Anthony Burke, as I said, lost the sight in his eye, but also, obviously, he sought treatment in hospital, and he went to the guards. And it was the next day then that Yousef Palani obviously had contacted Aidan Moffat in the same way. Aidan Moffat was a 42-year-old man, again, living alone, an auctioneer, really well-known Fine Gael activist. And I think that was the Sunday, the 10th, and he left. He was out socializing, and he left, I think, in the afternoon or late afternoon, went home, and his body was found the next day after friends, raised the alert because they couldn't contact him. And his body, what Yousef Palani did to him was, obviously went to his place, and he stabbed him over 40 times. He decapitated him, placed his head on the bed facing the door, and it almost seems, and there was also a bottle of bleach as well, and it almost seems like he was starting out. It was very disorganized, and it almost seems like he was trying to find his signature you know, which is what serial killers do, you know, so that I suppose those in authority know, well, this is he's marking his territory here. This is his, you know, it's clearly the same person. And Yousef Palani, it's almost like he was trying to establish a signature for himself, which is really chilling and disturbing. And probably all because he was Googling and using, you know, researching, you know, previous killings. And his MO was very precise, but then the actual signature was a bit different. That was really chilling. And obviously those who came across it shocked them to the core, you know, the ambulance service, what they found there. Then, so it was 2 days later that he targeted Michael Snee, who he also contacted on the app. Again, Michael Snee, a gay man, 58, hospital porter, living alone. And these were all within a few miles of Yousef Palani's house. So he could cycle there within minutes, you know. And this is also in terms of serial killers, and starting out, they would carry out their crimes, you know, in areas that they are familiar with. And this is what was happening here, that he knew he could, you know, escape quickly on his bike. And he carried out the killings at their home. So Michael Snee was found by, I think it was his nieces the next day, because at this stage they had found Aidan Moffat's body. And then they had the report, the guards, from Anthony Burke. And so they were putting the pieces together. And at this stage, when they found Michael Snee's body, it was because the guards were going around. Anthony Burke was helping them in their inquiries in terms of the app and who Yousef Palani was in contact with. So they were going around Sligo contacting men who were gay, who might be a potential target. And so this was publicized, and people locally found out about this. And so his nieces went to warn him. And that's when his body was found. And he, again, was stabbed, I think it was over 20 times. And his hands were tied behind his back, as were Aidan Moffat's, actually. And in this case, Yousef Palani placed 2 knives in a cross on the bed. So again, a different, you know, again, they were both hands tied behind their back, but a different signature, not very, very different, but still, you know, they still, you know, stabbings and atrocious stabbings, but the MOs were similar, but the signature was a little bit different. And it was at that stage that the net was closing on Yousef Palani. He didn't know this, but apparently on the 10th, after he killed Aidan Moffat, he was seen getting out of a car laughing. So that was really disturbing as well. And so in terms of, they found Michael Snee, Anthony Burke, helped the guards through the app to find out where Yousef Palani lived. And eventually they found out that some local person recognized him, said he lives here, and they arrested him after that. So it was really, in Sligo, it was shocking. And I suppose everybody locally would have known what happened and who was responsible. But in terms of the why, it's really hard for people to, I suppose, realize and to come to terms with kind of what happened there.
What do you make? It's very interesting, the kind of sequence of events. I think it probably tells us a lot about him. The fact that his first act, which he planned on being a murder, and stabbing someone in the eye, incredibly brutal. It's the type of thing that I think the normal human mind, if you did it, it would be, it would kind of haunt you. It would constantly be in your head.
Oh, but yeah, lack of. But he just detached himself, you know, he was able to detach himself from what he was doing. Yeah.
And then the next day he went on to do what was by far his most brutal act, like you said, decapitation, over 40 stab wounds. He did the place in the head. And then the next day, the next killing had about half as many stab wounds.
Yeah.
It didn't involve something as brutal as a decapitation. Yeah. That kind of like time period between each, I was going to say that must tell us a lot about him. He must have been perfectly fine with it to do one brutal act and then go on to do his most brutal. And then maybe he took it down a notch.
And I suppose we don't know where he was going with this. I mean, the guards they're adamant, and they're probably, in terms of, they're playing it down, but they feel that he definitely was going to kill if he wasn't caught at that point, thanks to Anthony Burke. if he wasn't caught at that point, that he would have gone on to kill at least 6 more people. And who knows what there wasn't a cooling off period. It was one, it was within the course of 4 days. It was very, very short cooling off period. So these are spree killings, as opposed to kind of a serial killer. You don't know where he was going to go with this. Was he going to continue over the course of that week and the next week? And then what was he going to do after that? Did he know he was going to be caught? Was he forensically savvy? It doesn't really seem so. Did he care if he was going to be caught? And you have to, was he balancing this up with, I don't care if I'm caught, because then I'll be notorious. I'll have made a name for myself. I have some sort of identity. I've attached myself to something. And that's that kind of really disturbed, looking for power and control that was driving him. From somebody who was, you could also say this was toxic masculinity on his part, or it was just somebody who felt really repressed in terms of his sexuality. He was frustrated with that. He was frustrated with he wasn't getting anywhere in life. He was frustrated with his lack of, intelligence, his lack of being able to progress as a person. And then you have, of course, that trauma from when he was ripped from his home, his war-torn country of Iraq, and the fact that he didn't integrate into society over there, and he was looking at his life and wondering where he was going. And who knows what happened? There may have been a breakup of a relationship that we don't know about. I mean, he was denying that he was gay, and so he's not going to admit that. But I don't think they found that trail. But who knows?
I was going to say, I mean, yeah, he can deny it all he wants, and he can say that's forbidden under Islam. But I think it's very clear. Like, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
If he just wanted to kill gay men, that there would be no sex or no touching or anything before. He clearly gay, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when the sentencing took place, the judge was really, struck by this. And they're all human beings. Sometimes we forget that. And it was Mr. Justice Mary Ellen Ring. She wanted to see photographs of Aidan Moffat and Michael Snee to remember them like that, instead of the evidence that she'd obviously heard during the sentencing hearing, and, praising them for who they were, and the fact that they were so much loved in the community and so well known in the community. And also in terms of Anthony Burke, that was assault causing serious harm, that Palani was sentenced to 20 years for assault causing harm as opposed to attempted murder, and that plea was accepted. But for Anthony Burke, he told of, his life has been ruined as a result of this. Like, the trauma from losing the sight in your eye in any circumstances would be traumatic, but in those circumstances, and the fact that he had kept his sexuality to himself, and then he was publicly outed in a town that's not huge, 20,000 people, and that he said people look at him and stare at him, and that's what he feels so impacted by this. It's horrendous, but he's been so brave, and he has spoken to the media, and he seems like a really lovely man, and I really wish him well in his thing. Hopefully he can start to heal after this.
I can imagine it would be particularly you get like trust issues from it, given that the previous day he had met him, and they had consensual sex. Like,
and but his instinct was telling him this is wrong, there's something not right here, and I'm sure that God, and he tried twice. He walked him out of the house. It's really, really sad for him.
Okay. This is something that I've just kind of noticed. I mean, it was clearly homophobic attack. He was targeting gays. That was the whole thing. I've seen in general, there's been way less. I'm over here in America, so I only see what's online. I think there's been way less coverage of this than there should be, and in particular the angle, the kind of the homophobic angle. I mean, there's plenty of these publications. There's plenty of these publications who would write like 100 articles if someone got misgendered or something way smaller than that, but who aren't touching this at all. I don't know. I personally think the fact that he's Muslim and a refugee, I think a lot of people are really really sensitive around that. They'd want to tiptoe around it. And
Mhm.
you know, there's a fear in today's media environment of being called racist or Islamophobic or
Yeah.
xenophobic or anything like that. Any opinions yourself as to why, if you think it has been getting less coverage than it should be, and why?
Yeah, well, it was certainly huge at the time when it happened in April 2022. It was massive, and you know, when you're thinking about, I remember when the first for Aidan Moffat, there was news of Aidan Moffat's body being found, and then another body of a male, and that was shocking, and it was huge. And I suppose the guards caught him so quickly and charged him that then the media are silenced. You know, in terms of all you can report on, then is it's different in the States, isn't it? Where in terms of contempt of court, you're only allowed to report on what happens within the district court hearing once they're charged. You can't go into any background, you can't speculate. It's very, very much direct reporting, because you always have to think about this person is going to go on trial before a jury and they can't be in any way prejudiced. That's as basic as it is. But in terms of when it comes down to when you know, everybody was probably expecting a trial, and a trial might sometimes get more coverage because it's going on obviously over a protracted period of time, and there are tidbits of information every day, and so it's a contained report from every day. But I suppose I think here it was pretty big. The reports were huge. It was front and center in terms of bulletins and newspapers and radio programs and TV programs. But as you say, it's globally and from an international point of view, you thought it would have attracted more attention. Yeah,
Um,
I can't speculate. Yeah, I guess the fact that he wasn't, like, the guards were very adamant about this, and they'd done their due diligence on it, that he was not radicalized, you know, and they looked into all of that. And of course, you remember the 350,000 in cash that they found in the house, and at the time, I'm sure they were thinking, "God, my God, is he? You know, is there some organized crime element here?" But no, they could find absolutely nothing, and they would have contacted Interpol and contacted authorities abroad, and no, nothing came back. So they'll continue to look into that money, but they are thinking perhaps that they brought that with them, the Palanis, when they moved over here. And another interesting factor in this case was that his family completely disowned him. They didn't go to any of the court sittings after that. Oftentimes you find, even when somebody is, you know, alleged to have carried out a horrific crime, their family are there in the background, but they didn't go to any of the court sittings, and they completely distanced themselves. And I think since it happened, I think Serica's writing that his dad hadn't been seen since it happened, you know. So from their point of view, can you imagine what they're going through in that small community where they already don't feel integrated? So I don't know what their plan of action is now, but you have to feel for them as well.